Good morning. Great to see you. I want to welcome you again to Cambridge City Christian Church. We're continuing our series on the book of Nehemiah. I'm excited to be able to share that with you, and I'm sorry if we did bug you just a little bit with the text this week. Appreciated what you said, Renee. Maybe it is something we do maybe a little bit more often, because we do need that reminder, don't we? I hope you've taken time to pray for our community and our church and really the world around us. It's exciting to see people coming back. I know a few more faces, a few more people are back today. It's great to see. It's things are getting better, but we want to continue to just keep in prayer that God would bring about His full and complete restoration to all of our lives. And we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 2 today, so if you want to go over in that direction. And I wanted to start off by asking you this question. How about this? Have you ever refused help when you know you need it? You ever done that before? You ever refused help when you really know deep down inside that you need someone to help you out? Oh, I've done that a lot of times. As a matter of fact, I think it happened just yesterday, right? My wife's over there shaking her head. Just yesterday this happened. Now, this wasn't in my sermon until yesterday, so God gave me a sermon illustration just this weekend, okay? So a couple of years ago, I built a greenhouse for my wife, and we have it in our yard, and we wanted to move it. So I'm like, okay, this is going to be interesting. How are we going to move this thing? So at first I thought, okay, I'm going to have to, take it apart. And I probably got 1 million screws in this thing. So I'm like, I really don't want to take this apart. So I went on to, where do you go to find all of the answers to life's problems? You go to Google, right? Or you go to YouTube or whatever. So I found a video that showed how you can move sheds, which it's kind of like a shed, how you can move a shed by using like boards and pipes, like as wheels, where you move them. So I thought, okay, this won't be too bad. So we set it all up, and we got it down. There was a little bit of a hill, and then we were bringing it straight across, and we were moving it probably 100, 150 feet probably, something like that. So it was a pretty good little distance. And we're pushing it down through there, and this thing's just going bad. But I'm like, I can do this. We got this. And so we keep working at it, but it's so slow going. But thankfully, my wife, she's smarter. I guess she knows this sermon better than I do today about how when you need help, you need to ask for it. Because she called up Kevin Cap, or I guess it was actually Nicole, and let them know. And so I'm working. I didn't even know she contacted him. And then here he comes up to save the day, and the whole thing just went so much faster. And I was so glad that someone asked for help. And for us, we really have a hard time asking for help. There was a story one time of a construction worker who was working, and as he worked, he fell and he hurt his back really, really bad. Well, he knew he needed to get the job done, and so he kept working, and he worked, but it kept hurting him. But eventually, it kind of subsided a little bit until one day he was out working, and he did something, and again he fell, and he hurt his back even worse. And his boss told him, "Hey, you need to go to the hospital. You need to get this checked out." And so when he goes to the hospital and he gets checked out, well, they find out that there was something extremely serious where it even endangered his life. And I think sometimes that's what we do. Like we wait and we wait and we wait. We hurt and we hurt and we hurt and we don't ask for help. And we wait until when it's almost like the worst it could be before we finally break down. And I guess I want to ask this question. Why is it that we refuse to help or to get help? Why do we refuse it so often? Why do we refuse to ask people to get help? How about this one? We've been taught for such a long time about how we need to be self-sufficient. We need to be self-sufficient. We need to take care of things on our own. Like, for instance, if you're grieving, maybe you're going through grief, maybe you've lost someone you love. So often we go through that grief all by ourselves. We kind of just wallow in it. We stay in it, and we don't reach out to someone. It's kind of like a silent battle. I think all of us have silent battles. There's things that are going on in our hearts and our minds that we just don't talk to anyone about. How about maybe relationship problems? If you're a student, maybe it's someone at school that you're not getting along with in a class, and you just kind of deal with it by yourself, and you don't talk to someone, and you don't reach out to them, or maybe it's in your marriage. Maybe you're struggling in your marriage, and you haven't reached out to get the help that you need. Maybe it's even at work. There's a coworker that's there that's just giving you a hard time, and you just kind of deal with it, but you don't talk to anybody about it. I mean, the list goes on, but we all have these things in our lives that we are struggling through that we don't ask anybody to help us with. And I wonder, why is that? And it's because one of the hardest things for us to do is to ask for help. That's one of the hardest things for us to do. It's so hard for us to reach out and to try to get the help that we need from someone. Well, thankfully, in the book of Nehemiah, we meet here in the second chapter, we see Nehemiah, who finally is ready to talk to the King Artaxerxes. Now, to give you a little bit of background, if you remember last week, King Artaxerxes was the ruler of the known world, of the Assyrian Empire. I mean, one of the biggest empires in all of history. And Nehemiah was a cupbearer. He was a cupbearer, which was like a close advisor to Artaxerxes. Well, so Nehemiah is in this pretty cushy position, right? His family had been taken out of Israel generations before. He'd grown up in that area of Assyria. He knew it very well, but he still had a longing for his heritage and for his upbringing and in past generations. And so he heard bad news about what was happening there. That the city was destroyed. Now, recently in that time, Ezra had gone back and rebuilt the temple, but the city itself was still in ruins, and it broke his heart, and he heard about it. And so he prayed, and that's what we learned last week, how important it is, if we're seeking restoration and rebuilding in our lives, if we're going to find the help that we need, we first have to pray. And so that's what Nehemiah did. And for 4 months, he prayed and prayed and prayed. He wasn't sure what it was that God wanted him to do, what it was that he needed to ask King Artaxerxes to do, but he prayed and prayed and prayed about it. And finally, we come here 4 months later into this chapter that we're going to look at today. So if you want to join with me, we'll have it on the screens. You can look in your Bible app as well, or in your Bible. I'll go ahead and read it. It says, "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king." Remember, he was a cupbearer. And he says, "I had not been sad in his presence before." So Nehemiah must have been a pretty upbeat, friendly, nice, outgoing, real boisterous kind of guy. And so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." So again, 4 months have passed, and in the midst of his work, it's starting to affect his work. Artaxerxes sees it on his face, that his heart is broken. You know, when I've looked at this passage, I thought to myself, isn't it neat how God so often uses broken hearts and even broken lives to accomplish his work? Because that's what we're about to see. Nehemiah's heart was broken. He was sad. He was downtrodden over what had happened. And so God was going to use that emotional impulse within him in order to spur him on, and we're going to see, and spur others on to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So as we read on, it says, "I was very much afraid." So Nehemiah, in the middle of going before the most powerful man in the world to ask him something, there's a sense of fear in him, because he knows that sometimes these things don't go quite well. This king could do whatever he wants. And so he's a little bit afraid, very much afraid actually, and he says to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" So here Nehemiah finds that he is in the middle of an opportunity for God to use him. His heart had been broken. He had been praying for months about this, and now the king wants to know what's going on. Now, it took him some courage to do this. It took courage for him to be able to do this. And then in verse 4 it says, "Then the king said to me, 'What is it that you want?' What is it that you want? What do you desire? What's going on? Why are you so down?" "And then I prayed to the God of heaven." Now, I love that little thing there. "Then I prayed to the God of heaven." I love how in that moment he whispered up a prayer. You know, most of the prayers that I offer throughout the day, I'll just tell you, they're not the bow your head, close your eyes kind of prayer. I don't do too many of those. Most of the prayers I do throughout the day are prayers that are sentences or paragraphs, kind of like I think what Nehemiah would have done here. When he was about to speak to the king and share with him what was on his heart, he asked God, okay, God, move in this situation, move in me, move in my heart, move in my mind so that I know what needs to be said. Prepare Artaxerxes' heart for what I'm about to say. See, that's a practice that I think all of us can do. I do this all the time. I go to the hospital. Or let's say I haven't been able to do that a whole lot over the last year, but when I've gone to the hospital, as I walk into a room, I always say a little prayer. Or if I'm going to meet with somebody, I pray for the meeting. It could be very short and brief. If I'm going to meet with somebody to talk about a situation in their life, I pray. I pray whenever I sit down to start work on my messages, I pray. God doesn't always require of us to sit down and do these 20-minute long prayers, okay? He wants us to be involved with Him throughout the day. So I would encourage you to do that like Nehemiah does here. What does he do? He prays. And so in the middle of that prayer, after that prayer, he answers the king in verse 5. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. See, Nehemiah knew that God works through kings. You know what? God works through leaders today. God works through you. And so he asks the king for assistance. What does he do? He does what so many of us, me first and foremost, are bad at, and that is ask for help. He asks for help, right? And then it says in verse 6, then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? And so it pleased the king to send me, and so I set a time. Now, when I read that, when I look at that, I set a time. He already had in mind, before he went into that room, what a plan would be in proceeding and rebuilding Jerusalem, as we'll see here more in a second. But when Artaxerxes gave him permission to go, he had been praying about this for 4 months. And then after 4 months, when the door opened, when Artaxerxes says, yes, you can go, while he was praying over those 4 months, a plan was coming to his mind. God was leading him in a direction so that he was ready when the door opened. And I think we need to do the same thing too. If we're looking for rebuilding in our lives, if we're looking for God to bring restoration into our lives in areas where maybe we've fallen apart, we need to pray about it, but we also need to keep our eyes open to what plan that God may have for us. What is it that he might have? And listen, in that plan, I'll tell you, sometimes when I listen to these plans as God shared them with me through the years, sometimes they come all at once, but usually it's in pieces. Like he'll show me this, and then I'll see this aspect of that. And then it kind of comes together, and I think that's what's going on here with Nehemiah. Because if you look in verse 7, it says, I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governor of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. So there he's dealing with the safety of himself and his people. And then in verse 8, and may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence which I will occupy. So he's asking for safety and he's asking for materials. That's exactly what they needed in Jerusalem to rebuild. They needed some security. They needed some materials. What did he do? He asked the king for help. He asked the king for help. See, the most important part of this plan in Nehemiah's mind was not what he could do. It's the help that he needed from God. And it's the help that he needed from other people. And then it says, and because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. Prayer and preparation. Prayer and preparation is what led to the transformation of Jerusalem. And the same holds true for us. It's no different for us. Same principles for us. Prayer and preparation. God uses that to bring transformation. And in verse 9, so I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. And when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. And that's a little bit of a harbinger of things to come. As they rebuild the walls, they run into some problems. See, even with prayer and planning, it doesn't guarantee that there won't be difficulties in the middle of it. Remember that. Sometimes what happens when difficulties come, we think, oh, well, the plan must not be working. And we give up on it. whatever that plan might be that God's given to restore you. But sometimes we have to work through the difficulties to find that restoration. And we will get into that, okay? So what is something here that we can take from this? One of the things I want to point out here from this passage that we just looked at, we'll put it up here on the screen, okay, is that finding help means using connections. That is exactly what Nehemiah did. He knew how to get connected to the right people in order to get the rebuilding, the restoration done. He knew to talk to King Artaxerxes, who was then able to talk to governors and talk to a person who was in charge of the forest that had the timber. He knew how to find the right connections and the right people. If you need help and you need restoration in your life, you need to do the same thing. Who are the people that can connect you with the right people? I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, I had someone here at our church call me and say, "Hey, Danny, I'm struggling. My mental health's really struggling. I really need to talk to somebody about this." And I could sense that they needed to talk to someone that was more trained than I am in that area. And so I said, "Sure, I know of somebody." And so I referred them, and they went, and I heard back from them last week, and things are going pretty good. But see, that's what I'm talking about, is if you are finding yourself in a place where you're struggling right now, and this pandemic has led all of us to struggle, right? I mean, all of us. I mean, we've dealt with something mentally, physically, emotionally, all of us have through all of this. Are you getting help in this restoration? Are you trying to seek out the right help? And doing it by connecting yourself with the right person is so important. It's so important, and that's what Nehemiah knew, and we need to know that too. Because, see, the point today is this. The point with our message today is that restoration requires the right people. We need the right people in our lives, the right people to connect to. You need someone to help walk through all of this with you. Maybe you need someone to help you walk through your grief. Maybe you need someone to help you walk through this relationship problem, a marriage problem, whatever it might be. Don't try to walk through that by yourself, because that's what we so often do. I know I've tried to do that before. Thankfully, there's been times I have stopped and said, "You know what, I can't do this. I've got to go talk to somebody," and I do. See, we need to be God-reliant, but the fact is that we also need to be people-assisted. God puts people in our lives so that we can be restored, so that we can grow. But the key is that we find the right people, because sometimes many people, I would say many times, many people, we'll put it here as well, many people seek restoration in the wrong places. We go to the wrong people to find restoration. Here, Nehemiah, in the passage, he knew exactly who he needed to go to. But so often we go to the wrong people. Now, some of us in the room here, most of us, I hope, we have relationships with those who don't have a close relationship with Jesus. But we have to remember that those that don't know Jesus and don't know his word very well, they have a different outlook and a different way of seeing things. And so we have to be really, really careful about what advice that we take from them. I mean, because that advice can come in forms that's not godly at all. As a matter of fact, sometimes what people might say, advice that they might give in restoring yourself, is to destroy someone else. You know, go to make yourself look better, let's go destroy someone else. But that's not what Nehemiah does here, is it? He says, I'm going to go find people to help me rebuild. I'm not going to go down there and say, "Hey, you know what? There's all these bad guys around and we're going to take it to them." That's not what he does. He's like, "I'm going to find the right people to rebuild, and if problems come our way, then we'll deal with it then. But we're not going to go down there starting a big fight." See, we need to find people who have godly advice, who could speak into our lives and give us the advice that we need. If you're students, I want you to think for a minute of some of the friends that you have in school. Who are the people that you listen to? Are they connected to Christ? Do they know God's word? Are you listening to their advice? Because I can guarantee you, maybe it's already happened to you, when you've heard their advice, it's led you down the wrong path. I'm not just speaking to students, I'm speaking to all of us. It can be somebody at work. It could be somebody even in your family. And so a little bit later, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back up and I'm going to share just a couple of things that we need to be looking for when we're trying to find someone to bring restoration into our lives. And maybe if we're the person that's called to bring restoration into someone else's lives, what is it that we need to have in our own life if we are going to help others be restored? love that passage because we are reminded that indeed our hope is in the Lord, and indeed, where do we find our greatest help? It's always in Him. It's always in Him that we find our greatest help. But we also know that we need to look for people in our lives who are the right kind of people who can help us to help bring about restoration in our lives. And so I want to ask this: what are some of the traits? What are some of the traits of someone who restores? Now, there's a lot of them. I didn't want to spend a ton of time, but I do want to give you a couple today that I think are so important for you. When you're looking for someone to bring restoration to your life, or if you want to bring restoration to someone else, there are two things that I think we learned here from Nehemiah that are just so essential for us to look for or even to do. And so here's the first one. The first one is this one, is that a person who brings restoration into someone else's life, what they do is they take time to assess. They're a person who takes time to assess. They try to understand whatever it is that you're going through, and they try to understand it. They show empathy, and they try to understand what's happening, and so that they pray over you, they pray with you. There's someone who is there that is going to go before God, and they're not just going to jump into it. You know, one of my problems that I struggle with, and I know it's something to do with my personality or whatever it might be, is that I'm the kind of guy that whenever I hear a problem, so like if one of my kids or my wife, they come up to me and they say that there's something going on, I'm the type of guy that I just want to give them the solution right then. Like, this is what we need to do. We need to do this. You know, and that's not good, and sometimes that's not what they want. What they want is they want me to hear and they want me to listen. They want me to assess what's going on and take time to think through it, and then maybe give some advice as God leads me, not just from my own mind, you know, right off the bat. And I think that sometimes that's what we do. We think that we have to solve things right away. Nehemiah here took 4 months of prayer before he was ready to talk to Nehemiah about what was on his heart and what was on his mind. You know what? We need to consider that as well when we're looking for someone to help restore, someone who will listen. And maybe if you're trying to bring restoration to someone else, are you a good listener? Are you someone who's willing to stop and listen to what someone has to say and to be discerning and to be patient and trying to understand what they're going through? You know what? We need to find people who have more discernment in their life. One of my concerns is that so many of us, myself included, what we do is we just connect with someone and we just take their word for it, and we don't stop and consider, are they really thinking through the advice they're giving me? Is this really good advice? Is this wise? Is this good? So often we don't do that. So we need to find someone who is willing to take their time to assess. Another thing we need to look for in a person is this one. We need to find someone who loves people or loves you and the truth. In John chapter 8, verse 32, Jesus said this. He said, what? He said, then you will know the truth, and what? The truth will set you free. So often we think to ourselves, I don't really want to know the truth because the truth is hard. Sometimes when we read or we hear the truth, it's something that's really hard to accept into our lives. But we need people in our lives who love us and who love the truth of God's Word. You know what? Restoration, if I mentioned last week, some of you may watch a lot of these home reno shows, right? Restoration often requires the destruction of things before they're rebuilt. Maybe in your life, there is the need for some destruction of some lies that you have accepted as truth in your life, and we need someone who is going to point that out to us. Now, they're not doing it because they're being a jerk. They're doing it because they love you, because they care about you. Because so much of what I've seen through the years is that people tend to kind of camp out in one thing or the other. If we can go back one slide, what people tend to do is we'll camp out in the know the truth part. So we know the truth, but we don't love people. Like we just want to just sock it to them. You know what? The church has been guilty of this for far too long. We go around and we batter people over the head with the Bible, and we don't have a relationship with people. And maybe we've done it ourselves, I don't know. But that is not the type of person that brings restoration. As a matter of fact, it can drive a wedge even further away between a person and God when there is no relationship. And then sometimes what I see is the opposite. I see relationship but no truth. I see someone who is afraid to maybe hurt their friend's feelings or to be honest with their friend, and so there is no truth involved, and so you can almost say anything goes. Those aren't the kind of people that we need in our lives. We need people in our lives who bring restoration, and what they will do is they will love us first, and then they will be honest with us. That's exactly what we need. That's totally what we need. Are those people in your life? And that's my challenge for today. We're going to bring it up here. Our challenge for this week, it's kind of I'll explain to you here. Our challenge is to find one and lose one. Now, what am I talking about? Here's a couple of questions for you. Here's what I'm talking about. A couple of questions. We'll bring it here on the screen, who is the wrong person in your life that you listen to too much? Now, all of us in this room have this person. Now, you may not be able to think of them right away. It might be something you're going to have to think through a little bit more even after you leave today. But who is the person in your life that you listen to way too much? Maybe they keep tearing you down. Maybe they keep tearing others down. Rather than loving and assessing, what do? They grow angry and they grow impulsive. Maybe they don't stop and try to figure out what's going on. You know, Jesus wants us to love people, love anyone, everyone, right? But Jesus, while he tells us to love everyone, he doesn't tell us that we should take everyone's advice. There are some people in our circles, whether it's at work or school, in our families, wherever it might be, there are people that are there whose advice we probably shouldn't be listening to, and so we need to redefine the relationship. We need to find new approaches to that relationship. Now, that doesn't mean you shun them. That doesn't mean you stay away from them. But what it does mean is that maybe some of the advice and some of the things they share with you that aren't rooted in the truth, maybe it needs to kind of go in one ear out the other, maybe. I think maybe we need to do that just a little bit more often. Who is that one person whose advice we need to lose? Okay. Now, here's the second question. Who is the right person in your life? Who is the right person in your life that you should be listening to more? I want you to think about that. Find someone this week that loves you, relationship, and loves God, loves the truth, right? There are people there. They are there. They're around you. If you look hard enough, you can find them. But all too often, we don't. Why? I know why, because I've done it myself too. Because I don't always like what they have to say. Right? I mean, sometimes that's just the way it is. But I know that they're telling me those things in truth. I know that they love me. So if they love me, they want the best for me, they tell me the truth, they're doing it for my betterment, not just to knock me down. Those people are there in your life, and you need to listen to them more. Now, maybe you haven't connected with them. Maybe their way of looking at things or thinking about things is different. Well, maybe they're different because they've been touched by Jesus. We need that kind of different in our lives. So find someone this week. Because here's something that's so important. Who you build with determines what you build. We're talking about restoration in this series. Who you build with determines what you build. So a few years ago, I did a series on friendship, and I talked about, I had a little saying that I can't take credit for it. I heard it from someone else, all right? But I've had many people in the church say it through the years when we were talking about friendship. Show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Okay? How about this one? Who you build with determines what you build. If you want a future that's filled with faith, that's filled with strength, able to weather life's storms, you find the right people to build with. Those people who love you, that will tell the truth and will assess what's going on in your life. And if you don't, if you want to live in a rickety little shack and when the next storm comes blowing through in your life, it blows you away, then don't find those people, because that's what happens. Who you build with determines what you end up building. What are you trying to build? What are you going to build? You know, I've wondered many times in my own life, how many times have I listened to advice, listened to quote-unquote wisdom that was actually leading to the building of a rickety old shed or cabin or whatever you want to call it. We've all done it. So let's start rebuilding with someone better. We need to find those people and use connections like Nehemiah did. There was a student who was he was taking a class on logic in college, pretty hard class. The professor was really, really tough, super tough. And his exams, people knew his exams were like the worst. I mean, they were just the hardest, the toughest. So thankfully, when the final exam came up, the professor decided to show a little bit of mercy. He said, I'm going to show the class a little mercy. And so he allowed them to have an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that they could use as a cheat sheet for the test. Oh, everybody was so excited. So when the day came, they came in for the test. They had their cheat sheet. And of course, I can remember some teachers when I was in school that let us do that. And you would write everything super small, trying to squeeze every bit of information you could. We didn't get an 8.5 by 11 though. Ours was like a 3 by 5 card or something like that. So this class was pretty lucky. But everybody comes into the classroom with it all scribbled out on their paper, and they're walking in, they're all happy, clutching it. But in walks the best student of the class, the one who got this whole logic thing down. He's got an A, he's got it all figured out, but he's walking in with an empty piece of paper, and everybody's like, "Really? Like, why are you walking in with this empty sheet of paper?" Well, he goes and he sits down. Okay, he sits down. And then he puts the piece of paper on the floor right next to his desk, just puts it there. And then in walks through the door somebody else. And what does he do? He comes over and he stands on the piece of paper. Now, this man that comes in and stands on the piece of paper, he is like an expert in this area. Like, he's known for logic and how good he's at it. So the professor comes in, and the professor notices this person that's not supposed to be in the class. He's like, what are you doing here? And the student then goes on to say that, hey, you said that as long as they fit on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, I can use them for the test. Sure enough, he stood right there. He got the expert, stood right there, and he aced the test. He just asked him, and he'd give him the answers. You know what? That's the kind of people we need in our lives too. And Jesus is that person. And God is also putting other people around us so that we can find those people. And so I want to encourage you this week, find one and lose one. Allow God this week to show you how to find wisdom and discernment and to find that restoration that you need.